Greetings, viewers, and welcome to another banquet of discussion in Roll Off a Tangent. I'm Robert Gibson, and my fellow team members are Nikita Zuev and XJ. This time we shall focus on John Wyndham's story No Place Like Earth. This is a sequel to his Time to Rest, which we dealt with in an earlier podcast. The earlier tale is set entirely on Mars, some years after the Earth has cracked open and disintegrated into a swarm of rubble, destroying almost all of Terran humanity. The only survivors being a few colonists on Mars and Venus, and the crews of some spaceships plying the ether in between. The protagonist, Bert, has taken psychological refuge in a nomadic lifestyle as a tinker, drifting along the Martian canals and eking out a living repairing household goods for the unmechanically minded Martians. These Martians are physically akin to Earth humans, but psychologically very different. They entirely lack the Terran go-getting urge and are content to live a basic and placid existence in harmony with their environment. Bert and the Martian girl Zalo are attracted to one another, but Bert is so traumatized by the loss of his homeworld that he cannot face any life other than one drugged by solitude. So he rejects the opportunity to settle down to family life with Zalo. Zalo's mother, however, believes he will come back. So ends Time to Rest. Now, in the sequel, No Place Like Earth, Bert hears news that disrupts his life again. While on a visit to one of the sparse settlements of Terran survivors on Mars, he is startled to learn that a spaceship will be bringing recruits to the settlement on Venus. A chance to grab at some fragment of his former life, maybe? He takes the plunge and enlists. The next scene opens on Venus. It soon becomes apparent that go-getting man has learnt nothing from the mess he made of Earth. The 50 or so female survivors are kept secluded in a compound for the exclusive use of the bosses of the colony. The rest of the men are put to work, some as slave drivers of the gentle Venusian natives. Bert soon rebels. Outraged at the cruelty of one of the slave drivers, he unleashes his inner Conan and slays the sadistic overseer and then flees. The final scene occurs back on Mars. With the use of flashback narrative, we are given some hints of how Bert managed to wangle a place on a ship that takes him back to the Red Planet. And with a lot of more good fortune than he deserves, he finds himself back with Zalo, who has waited for him, giving him a second chance at some contentment. That's the plot, a lot more plot than there was in Time to Rest, although I don't think that this story is as good as the previous one, which was a masterpiece in my view. Just 1 or 2 points before I hand over to my colleagues. Uh, to me, the story's importance is that it shows that humanity in the collective humanity is just hopeless. It really is time one gave up on the species. But there is still some salvation possible to individuals like Bert if he gives up on the extraordinarily self-destructive, go-getting human urge. Now, that's my little take on it. I like the story. We'll see what my colleagues think. In alphabetical order, how about Nikita?
I before I talk about what I feel, I want to ask you something, Robert. Because when stumbled upon this tale, this sequel during our initial first episode on John Wyndham, um, it was an astonishing discovery for all of us, because I mean I
mm,
didn't know that there was a sequel, and you had no idea that the
yeah.
tale was continued. And you also said that Mr. Wyndham is not known for making sequels. So how, from that perspective, how did it feel for you to sort of discover the fact that this tale exists, and how did you feel, as you read it? What was the feeling that you had within you,
Mm.
that you've learned of a sequel to something that you read so many years ago and now could experience it
Yeah,
in a
I
new
was
light?
fascinated to learn that there was a sequel, and I was excited to read it. And I do think it's an exciting story. When I say it's not as good as the first one, I don't mean to put people off it. I simply meant that the first tale had an extraordinary, shall we say, a gift for atmosphere and for writing a riveting story without drama, if you like. There is internal drama in Bert's mind, but there's no exterior drama really, and I really liked that. Um, the second story has quite a lot of drama in it, and all right, I don't mind drama, but uh, it was riveting in a different way, in that because I'm so impressionable and easily led by clever writers, I got really quite sort of on the edge of my seat, as it were, wondering what was going to happen to Bert and whether he would actually come to his senses and uh, take the opportunity for happiness before it was too late. And really, it should have been too late, but by some extraordinary good fortune, uh, he manages to get out of this ridiculous Venus expedition and get back home. So
Hmm.
I found it a very emotionally stirring story, though a different way from the first one.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for answering. I just wanted to hear about
Mm,
your experience, because I've felt something very similar when I discovered um, certain tales of Pushkin that I didn't read as a kid. That was either, because of the um, because of our school program, or a chance of fate that I didn't know they existed. And it was really exciting for me to read them.
mm,
That was the shot, for example, that you guys read.
right.
I haven't heard of the story. um so to get to experience something from a favorite writer or author, it's truly something, at
Mm,
least in my experience. So thank you for sharing. As for what I think about No Place Like Earth, I have very mixed feelings about the tale. So I think the beginning is very strong. I i like the points that it's trying to make. I like the idea that Bert, buys in quite quickly into what clearly seems like some sort of a scam. Nobody would be coming to, um, like, to somewhere else to take you back to a paradise. You know, that's not how
mm,
humanity is. Um, and it would have been a really strange situation if that's what actually had occurred. I mean, it. Let me put it this way: it's not impossible that somebody could have good intentions, um,
mm,
but it would be one in a million chance, right?
mm,
Um, so yeah, I instinctively knew that something was gonna be wrong, but I applaud the situation, the story itself, because I could believe that Bird wouldn't see it coming, because he was young when Earth blew up. And this feeling of desire for duty that he has, that was so well pointed out in Time to Rest. Yeah, and the Venus expedition and so on and so forth is also talked about, like, briefly, but it's talked about in No Time to Rest. So it's interesting that there are sort of like little nuggets in the other tale to enhance this one.
Hmm.
the the mood is great, the way it's written is great. Um, and here come my issues, and it's truly about the end of the story. Because until this point, I mean, yes, we are talking about a situation where Martian exists, and you can breathe in space. You know, like on Mars, there's atmosphere, and Venus, you're doing more than fine. Like walking around, there's like a jungle or something. So those points are obviously not realistic, but we're taking the character seriously. We're taking the situation seriously. It is realistic in a sense that these are real human emotion, and you can believe what's happening in the sense of believability of the actual outcomes and situations. And then the story jumps the proverbial shark, and it has the protagonist kill someone, feel nothing for it, have no sort of like discovery about the situation of doing something so ill and terrible, and then they the story frames that as a valiant effort of an individual, and then it's highlighted by the fact that like a couple of pages later, oh, it's not just one body that Bert is leaving behind. He destroys an entire spaceship of people, good people, bad people, it doesn't matter. He is acting like it's fine, like it's okay, it's cool. I'm Conan, as you put, Robert, right? He is acting like a pulp fiction character for the last 2 or 3 pages of the tale, and he gets the girl, and it's all happy ending, and it just doesn't fit the rest of the story or the prequel. It you know,
Hmm.
it took me out of the situation, and it really I have to say tore me apart because I was like, I really like the story, and then this happens, and I'm just like, what do I say on the podcast? Because like 95% of the story is great. It's just as thematic as Time to Rest. It's even more visceral. It's even sadder, right? Like somehow Wyndham manages to give us the fact that there are still people surviving and there's a chance for humanity, which was the saddest part of the last story, that wasn't happening. And he makes it sad that there are people who survived. He makes it sad that we are continuing. You know, he makes it
Hmm.
super depressing, actually.
Hmm.
So the resolution, the happy resolution that sort of like starts in the story, it's sort of quickly subverted into being, no, 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 this is still terrible, right? But then I don't know, it's just the fact that Bird becomes suburban commando in the last 2 pages really threw me off. I still haven't decided if I like the story or not, so I'll think
Hmm.
about it some more. I'll give XJ the time
Hmm.
to say his piece.
So, uh, so the story stopped being a story after basically the recap, and in my opinion, at least, the whole thing reads more like a parable. Like it's like a treatise where the author writes out his philosophical thoughts on some issues, and that's why, and I think that's why, as a story, it doesn't quite work in a dramatic sense, because this is really more like the author pouring out his thoughts on some issues and sharing it. It is like an essay in a more um, uh, dressed up in theater, I suppose. It is a moral parable. Uh, and actually, before I go on, um, well, I'm not sure if I like this story or not, just like Nikki. But before I actually go on, I wanted to ask both of you what you personally feel about the the setting itself, like humanity is now in Venus, and then they are doing what they're doing, versus the bunch of people that are now on Mars doing what they're doing. Like
Mm,
when you look at the two different groups of people, what do you feel? What do you think?
yeah. I
Tiny
think
correction. There are three groups of people. There's also the Soviets on the other side of Venus. But yeah, go on. Sorry.
I have a feeling that the Soviets on the other side of the planet is a little bit like uh
Murmur's Tale, like,
no,
also doesn't actually.
Oceana in 1984, a boogeyman.
Yeah, that's what a Murmur's Tale is. Yeah, it's like
yeah.
it's not real. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, Oceania was the protagonist's state,
Right.
but
What was the other one?
see what you mean. They were Eurasia and East Asia.
Yeah. Okay.
But anyway, I get your point. Um, yeah, I think it's fraught with trouble for the future, which shows how seriously I start to take these fiction when I start reading it, because I think to myself, oh no, if humanity does succeed in creating a strong state on Venus, the next thing they'll do will be build a fleet of spaceships and start going to Mars and enslaving the Martians as well. So there'll be no escape from tyranny. So I just hope and pray that some Venusian disease, fortunately wipes out this miscreant species before it can do any more damage.
Sorry. God.
Or maybe they just blow Venus up like they presumably human beings blew the Earth up. Um,
Hmm. All right. I guess I'll take a stab of what I think. The setting itself is quite intriguing. Um, I think there was a huge opportunity lost within this tale to sort of contrast the idea of two good sides that are possible and two bad sides that are equally possible, right? If Bert just simply returned to Mars and he was like, okay, guys, the people on Venus, they suck. Here is this atomic spaceship. Let's go back and do something about this, rather than making his own little paradise on Mars and basically saying, whatever, fuck the good fight. I think the story would be stronger. So the setting itself is really it has a lot of raw potential, but I think it remains unused until today.
hmm,
Okay.
hmm.
Uh,
Hadn't thought of that one.
I guess I shall continue. I shall complete what I was about to say. I'm not sure if what I have to say next is going to sound comfortable to a lot of people, to be honest. Um, I wonder what it was going through Mr. Wyndham's mind when he wrote this, to be frank. Uh, and the first story was great because the Venusians were not brought into focus and we knew nothing about them. And as far as we know, Bert and the people stuck on Mars were quite possibly the last of humanity, and that made it very different because they were refugees and hanger-ons and the last of their kind. But now that there's the focus on Venus, it becomes very, very different. And I look at the thing, and I look at the thing, and I see it. It's like Mr. Wyndham is describing two different kinds of colonialness. And when I was in Japan for 5 years, and Japan was a very, very interesting experience for me, and it was very I was in Tokyo for that whole time, and Tokyo is a very metropolitan city. Japan is a pretty homogeneous country, but within Tokyo itself, there are actually a lot of people from all over the world. And this is a part that's going to be probably uncomfortable, but there are a lot of Westerners that come to Japan, and they have a terrible attitude. Just a small sub section of them, and I'm not just talking about white guys. I'm talking about black guys, brown guys, yellow guys. As long as they come from the West, they come to Japan with a certain expectation that Japan should bend its way to them, and they didn't find what they want there. And it's not just men, it's also women as well, and they just get very upset, and they just say, Japan is terrible. They complain about Japan every day, and it becomes a drag hang out with them. And they kind of remind me, these Westerners, they kind of remind me of Bert. He could have found happiness on Mars, but he had expectations that Mars didn't meet. And so he's not complaining about Mars, but he's obviously not satisfied there, and he's looking for a way out. In the first story, it is not so much, it doesn't come across that way, because there is no other way out for him, and he's yearning for a lost home, and that's a different thing. He was more like a refugee. But now that there is the Venusians, which was sold to him as like a rebirth of old Earth, then it becomes a completely different thing. Now he has in scare quotes a place to return to, and then his attitude completely shifted, and or I should say, the lens in which I saw him completely shifted, and he became more like those guys.
I think Japan. I know exactly the point where this happened for you. Was it the conversation with the old man, where the bird was slowly going towards the?
No, actually, that was that was later on. But the one that started was was Wyndham's description of the Martians right at the beginning, and it sounded a lot to me like those sexpats that go to Thailand or Southeast Asia, and they're describing.
Oh, I see.
And then
so when he's describing the Martian.
Yeah, like they're describing, like when he was describing the Martians, it sounded like what some sexpats think of Southeast Asia. And it's like, and I'm looking at that, and I'm like, you know what? I don't like where this is going. And then when it went to Venus, it's even worse, because that is out and out colonialism from like the 18th century, when they were rounding up, when the English was had this really nasty rule in India. And Rob, you're from England. I'm not trying to offend you, but the 100 years, the 40 odd so years before World War II, the English killed off more Indians than the Germans managed to do to the Nazis, do to the Jews. The Nazis did to the Jews, and in less time too. If you stretch out the average, just because they were so cold. Well, what's the word? Indifferent to the famine that was striking the Indians, and they just took the grain out anyway, and then they just let everybody starve to death, and it was very much like what happened in Ireland during the potato famine. And I look at the Venusians, the lens in which I look through the situation in Venus, I'm like, it's like the same thing, man. And I'm not sure what was in Mr. Wyndham's mind when he wrote this. Maybe he was like saying, a bird in hand is better than two in the bushes. He was approaching it with that kind of philosophy, and maybe he was also thinking, like some of the colonial attitudes uh, of the empire, because Mr. Wyndham is also British at that time, was maybe not to his liking. But to me, no there is a difference between what was happening on Venus and Bert in Mars, and that is the degree of brutality, but the mindset to me is the same. And that's, I'm not sure it I really felt like it's not that I dislike the story. It's like I wish I have the chance to sit down and talk to Mr. Wyndham. Discuss this with him.
Mm.
I don't know what your problem is actually, XJ, because I thought the author was clearly condemnatory of the colonialist uh, Earthmen on Venus.
He
It's,
was
it's a clear condemnation.
yeah, he clearly condemned that, but he is also making the point that Bert would be happier on Mars. And I look at Bert in Mars in pretty much true. It's a different kind of colonialism, if you know what I mean. I don't like either, because there is a sort of attitude like the Martians are simple, they don't strive, and
Well, that's true, but that's the point. I think that the story shows that way of life is
the
better.
way I look at it is that is Mr. Wyndham's perspective on what
Oh,
seems to be
mm.
a bunch of people who are more seated, who take life more slowly, and that's his interpretation. But is
Well,
that really
that's
the
how they
case? Is that really the case? Because, and what I'm trying to get at is that a lot of Westerners come to the east side of the world, or Southeast
Mm.
Asia, and they have a certain view of the natives there, which may or may not be what the natives actually think of themselves. You know what I mean?
Well, you mean that it might be a kind of metaphor for uh, certain views of
Of
the
of
non-Western societies on
yes,
Earth,
yes.
but but supposing it isn't, supposing that he actually means what he says, that there are these Martians who simply don't have the go-getting
And
attitude.
that's what I wish I can talk to Mr. Wyndham about, because I want to ask him, what is it that you're really writing about? Because it's clear to me this is not a story. This isn't a story. This is a parable. This is Mr. Wyndham trying to put down his views and his thoughts into this story written form. And unfortunately, he's not around anymore, and I
Mm.
will never know. But I would love to have sat down and talked to him and asked him, what are your thoughts? What are you really thinking?
Well,
And
I think that you go in reading a story like this, one goes by what's attractive, and I find the Martian way of life enormously attractive, perhaps partly because um, they are the legatees, if you like, of the great ones who are not really explained in the story, but they've been given a heritage of a world which you can live in fairly comfortably. Um, because these great ones built the canals and so on, so they don't have to strive and build the world themselves. It's been done for them, and they can simply sit back and, as it were, enjoy life as it's meant to be lived, which is, if you like, there's a kind of numinous um, glory about sheer living which they've got, and I don't think that that's anything to be disturbed about. I think it's 100% positive, a positive vision of life.
Well, I mean, that's, you see, here's the thing, right? I hear echoes of that about all the time, about how about from the west side, about Tibet, about Bhutan, about, you know, all this all these more less developed countries in our world. And I think to myself, because I come from a similar region, and I know for certain that we aren't always what the Westerners think we are, and that is why I have the thought in my mind: is this how Mr. Wyndham views, say, Indonesia, Cambodia, Thailand, Bhutan, Nepal, and then he's transporting that view, projecting it onto the Martians? That's what I think. That's what I'm thinking. And I like I said, I seriously wanted to sit down and talk to Mr. Wyndham about it, but unfortunately, that is a conversation that can't ever happen.
No, but we can guess from his novels what his predominant attitude to life is, and it's a very bleak one, because almost all his novels, except possibly Trouble with Lichen, are to do with, and perhaps Chucky as well, are to do with the struggle for survival between competing species.
Technically,
And,
this,
you know,
conversation that you're talking about actually could happen if somebody creates the same machine that Robert had in Reconstructions. Then you could have an actual sit down with John Wyndham.
mm,
If I may, I want to cut in here because I think I've got something to say. As a mostly neutral party in this conversation, um, I can see what XJ is talking about very well. Now that he's painted the picture, now I've had the issue that the protagonist was was basically a pussy. That's kind of my problem, right? That he was like, all right, whatever. I'm just gonna reserve myself to life on Mars. I'm not gonna help anybody, and then I'm gonna murder a bunch of people, right, for fun. And that was kind of my issue. But now with XJ's new perspective, if I may try to give it like a short metaphor for you, Robert. So basically XJ, I think, is saying about Bert is that he's like, okay, well, I'm gonna go live with the natives and savages better than like living with these people because those are simple people. They'll understand me. They won't make problems for me. They are simple folk who, like, have simple lives and not a care in the world and not a worry. We should live more like them, and so on and so forth, right? So it comes from to me, it comes from a perspective of a person who, like, knows nothing what he's actually talking about when it comes to the life of the people that he wants to join, right? And it's this sort of like perspective fantasy that he projects upon these natives, um in order to have this like dream fulfilled, right? So that's, I think, the what XJ saw in the story, right, and what
That's
really
pretty much
disturbed him.
it, actually. That's a great summary. Thank you, Nikki.
mm.
I
But
can listen sometimes.
he spent years. He hasn't just suddenly developed this caricature of in his
There
mind. But
are there are
he
people
spent years and years drifting
there
on.
are people who spent years and years in Asia and
Yeah,
never knew the people there. I'll just
yeah,
say that.
What I think, Robert, you have to look at it from this perspective. XJ is talking from experience, right? He's talking
yeah.
from a situation where he felt such such things happening to him and to culture that was close to him in front of him. So it was like a raw situation that he was experiencing, right? So for us to be like, well, that's not what's really happening in the story, I think it doesn't really matter whether we think that's what's happening in the story or not, because that's basically XG had these feelings evoked by the story, and it disturbed them, right? That's what the
Mm,
conversation is really about. It's not whether the story is or not saying that, right? Because again, as unless reconstructions is created, we'll never ask Mr. Wyndham.
mm.
um it's actually just to do with the fact that Exodus fell this way, and it's a point that maybe we should discuss. So actually,
Yeah.
in exactly, I mean, so to me, it seems, unless you wanted to say something, Robert. Sorry, go on.
No, 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 no.
Okay, okay, okay. So one of the one of the biggest things about, for me, like the aspect of Bert that sort of gets lost from one story to the other is the fact that, like, so in the previous one, he was sort of this reluctant man who is now within the situation, and his misgivings and his thoughts can be forgiven, right? Because he's in a very stressful point in time. But if you analyze it with now knowing how the second story is, uh, do you feel like the first story has now changed for you as well? Has Time to Rest, like, has its tones have also now altered, or is this only in the sequel that you have issues with it?
Is that a question for XJ, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, you
Oh,
could. Oh,
it's for me. Mm, That's a difficult question to answer, to be honest, because I have to know what Mr. Wyndham is thinking when he wrote this.
mm,
From my point of view, it definitely did color uh, the first story, because, excuse me, it's a direct sequel. So so
mm,
it's of course it is connected, and the way it changes the story for me is now the very quiet, very contemplative atmosphere within the first story is now, I have to say, solid, because not because of the Venusians or the Martians or Bert himself or the elements within the story, but that it is impossible for me now to look at the first story without also thinking of it as a parable, like like a like a point that the author, Mr. Wyndham, is trying to get across.
mm. Okay.
Because now the second story is, so to me, it's so out and out uh, a I would say it's a tract, written in story form. Uh,
Yeah.
it's impossible for me to now look at the first story without seeing it from that perspective as well.
Perspective. Yeah. Okay. So, but now
Mm.
let's try and be a little bit on Robert's wavelength. If we assume the best intentions from Mr. Wyndham, we assume that this is, like the things the parallels that you've created, XJ, turn out to be more or less not accurate, right, to what he desired to say. If that is the case, do you feel like there is a salvation for the story? And if these, what is it called, if John Wyndham really didn't think of these situations and problems that you saw, um within the tale, what would your perspective be then, if you could try to um sort of like move yourself away from that experience? I know it's hard, but
I think that is not quite the right question to ask, to be honest.
mm,
Uh, so in the first place, I don't really have an issue with the story itself. If we stretch the definition of story to be very loose, and I don't have an issue with the world building either. I mean, it is it is pretty much it's Mr. Wyndham would have to rewrite his story, uh, No Place Like Earth, for me to he has to rewrite it in a way that is not so obviously to me a tract or a parable.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
So what you're saying to
Basically
yeah.
less if okay, so first of all, if that conversation with the old man hadn't occurred on Venus, if the 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 description of the Griffiths and the Martians were a little bit less authoritative, and there's more of it's hard to put into words. Like if he had approached the Martians and the Griffiths from a more world building point of view, like these are their own thing and then they are such and such, then it probably would work a little bit better. You know, like if this is an
Hmm.
actual story and and not
Sorry.
a and not a tract, it would I mean, it would have to be rewritten that way. It's like I just can't see. It's very hard for me to read the story as a story, because not because of my experiences, but just because of the way it's written. If that makes sense.
Hmm. What? Why do you think that um what's it called? Why do you think that we didn't see the parable? Do you think it's because we haven't had the same experience as you in life when it comes to sort of the cultural we can't hear you if you're talking.
So first of all, I'm a huge fan of John Wyndham,
Mm.
and and so I have something to compare this particular work with the rest of his works. Uh,
Uh-huh.
John Wyndham has always been philosophical in his writings. Every one of his books had some ideas that he wanted to explore that is outside of the story itself. But he has always done so in a much more masterfully way. It's like you can sense that in A Time to Rest, but it was so much more atmospheric. Whereas for this particular story, it is way more blatant and in your face. And you might not come across to Nikki or perhaps even Rob. But for me,
Mm.
it's like the contrast is quite strong. In this one, it's more I think this, therefore this, and such and such. Whereas in his other stories, it was less obvious. It was way more subtle.
I have to admit, now that you mention it, there was the whole juxtaposition of this old guy speaking to Bert, and that's like our introduction scene to Venus. It was very jarring for me.
Yeah, and that
Um,
is if I have to pin it down, I think that would have been the one thing I would have taken away. Uh, that made it very clear that it was a tract to me
I
anyway.
think. Oh yeah, yeah, no problem. Sorry. Um, yeah, I have more to say about the tale. Uh, they are much less. Let me put it this way. My comments much less intellectual than what actually has raised. Uh, they're all about the pew pews and the ha-has and the boo boos, right? So, I just want to, from my perspective, before I do go on from that point, I think the fact that like that you felt reading that tale and seeing those parables and and what's it called, and it made you not like it, I think that's totally fine. I think there's nothing wrong with you know looking at
Again,
a tale.
I want to stress it's not
Yeah.
whether I like it or not. It's that there are several things I want to sit down and talk to Mr. Wyndham about because I feel
Okay.
it's
Well, however
unresolved.
yeah, sure. However you want to call it. I just think that like uh we shouldn't try and deny your perspective just because like I didn't see it, right? Or Robert didn't see it. So I think it's good that you um what's it called, made such an extensive uh what's it called, such extensive points about how you felt and why you felt it, because now I understand much better, what was happening, and why you want to talk to Mr. Wyndham. Robert, do you have something to say before I go on to my silly bullshit?
Hmm. I think that the way I read stories is um, open to a lot of criticism. In that I well, the good thing about the way I read stories is I think I do latch on to the way the author hopes. I'm guessing here hopes that the story will be read, and that means that if my latching on or my enjoyment or whatever you want to call it reaches a certain threshold, then the author can commit as many mistakes as he likes, but I simply won't notice them because I am now kind of hypnotized by the story. Whereas I think that you guys have a much more critical intelligence than I have. I go mainly by feeling, and that's there's something to be said for that. But I can see that I might miss important things. That's all I've got to say really at this particular point.
Hmm. Fair enough, fair enough. Okay, so back to No Place Like Earth. um I think it's rather dreadful, the idea that your protagonist, look, it's in some way realistic that he would just be like, you know what, fuck it, I'm not saving anybody, I'm just going home and I'm just gonna live here and whatever, and I'm just not gonna solve any problems, right? But if you're trying to give a happy ending to a story, you're gonna do something more than that, right? Because that's what I presume John Wyndham tried to do in the end. That like, okay, Bert gets to live another day and he gets to have a happy ending on Mars with his Martian girlfriend, right? Which is like, okay, you to me it's like you either go and you go full depression, and Bert, after he kills that dude on Venus, he like takes the gun, and he ends it all, right? Or he does something with his life. Because this like cop out of like, I've become a murderer and I'm gonna destroy the last ship that humanity can use in order to travel space. Like, he's not a protagonist at that point. He's like the supervillain of the tale. No matter what the other people did on Venus, he has literally like destroyed humanity's last hope. Whether humanity is good or bad, it doesn't really matter. He's just doomed the species, right? With his destruction of the spaceship. Because if, let's say, even if it's not used as a spaceship, that is a nuclear generator, right? It could be used for so many things. So the fact that he just destroys it, and it's like, I don't know, 60 words are put into the tale about the fact that he like destroyed countless human lives, and its spaceship that was one of the crutches humanity was using in its desperate time of need. When
Well, I
I
mean, humanity
Yeah.
was simply using its talents to enslave another species. So uh, I don't see there was any point uh, in trying to help humanity. If
Well,
we
no, you get your Mars buddies. I already said this point before. You get your Mars buddies. You overtake the ship, because he says, right? He says that this is one of the trips that he did from Mars to Venus. So he did this several times. So, which means that he has put several people into the terrible position that he was in, and then he
Right.
destroyed the ship, right? So he had
Mm.
more than enough time to be like, "Hey, Martians, guys, it sucks there. Don't go. I've got a weapon. I know how the ship works. We gotta do something about this." He had like all the time in the world. Instead, he cowered and let other people get taken and continued the terrible travesty that he himself escaped. And the fact that nobody found out about the guard dying or something is also crazy. Anyway, it's just the story literally falls apart in my hands the more I think about the ending.
Well,
I
I
haven't even
missed all that, I must admit. It just goes to show that we've got very different ways of reading stories.
but you can see what I'm saying, right? You're
Yeah, yeah,
not
I can see what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So it's got nothing to do with like I can also see it from your perspective, right? I can also turn off my brain and be like, okay, um it's a happy ending, that's the end of it, and so on and so forth. But
Mm.
like there's certain mm, there's certain enjoyment actually in thinking through the situation or what had transpired. When it's a good story, it makes you notice all the beautiful details that the writer put into it to get you to this conclusion. And when the story crumbles, then it is the other way around. It is now interesting to see exactly why this wouldn't work and how to do it better.
Yeah. We don't really have this problem with Conan stories, do we?
No, no. I
No.
mean, but I mean, from the start, the guy's a savage killer, right? So we're like, okay, we got it, man. Let's go. Yeah.
I think I think Robert E. Howard never pretended to be anything except an entertainer,
That's
you
right.
Mm.
know. And I think there's an honesty to that I very much appreciate. Whereas you raised up some really good points about the plot structure, Nikki. But the funny thing, the paradoxical thing is that I accepted all of that. Honestly, if you want to go even earlier, right? Bert was singing on the banks of a Martian river, and then the next paragraph is in Venus. You remember that part?
Mm.
I was
Yeah, yeah.
like, I was like, that was such a sudden jump, and I had to reread that part to to grasp the fact that there was a time skip.
Mm.
And paradoxically, because I don't read this as a story, I accepted all of that. Yeah, but if it just doesn't like it, there are some really poor. If we look at it as a story, then there are definitely some very poor structural. There are some structural issues with it,
Mm.
and
Yeah, which is oh, sorry, go on.
the ending part you brought up was really, it was a very strong point. But it's just that by the time I got to it, I'm like, meh, whatever. It's clearly not a
Mm.
story to me anyway. To me.
Right, 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 right. Yeah, I mean,
Mm.
hashtag we're all entitled to our own opinions and all that stuff. Um, I mean, okay, all right, 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 all right. Here we go. Okay, so instead of writing a sequel to this story, because I honestly don't wanna. I feel like Bird doesn't deserve it. And if it looks, if you look over it from either points, either if you're looking at it from XJ's perspective, or from my perspective, right? In either way, he's either a terrible murderer, or a xenophile. Like both of them are really not that great a picture of an individual. Um, I think maybe this time we could do a because last time we did like what's it called? We didn't do like what we would do for time to rest, right? We didn't do like, oh, what would our sequel be? Um, if either of you want to join me on giving a sequel a go as an idea, tell me. But here's my one. I'll give you some time to think. So time to rest ends on a good point where um, our dear friend, um, Bert, at the time not so horrible, runs off because he can't deal with the idea of marrying. Right? It's like he still hasn't let go of Earth, and I would make the story about. Oh no, we did talk about a sequel, and I said it was going to be about his children. But now, knowing what the sequel is, I'll change that slightly. Um, I would focus on the idea of the great old ones, on the idea of what Mars is about, and Bert learning what Mars is more and more, because now he decides that the only way he could be with Mars is if he understands Mars. And so he goes inwards into the catacombs, into the ruins, and you do this whole Indiana Jones thing, right? Where he's got these like electrical torches. I don't know. I'd make something up. And he sort of like goes through the history of what has transpired here and gets to the bottom of who the great old ones. And there would be some great revelation that the great old ones are the Martians. It's just that they simply decided that it was no longer a good idea to go the direction they were going, because they were creating cities and infrastructures and civilizations, and then they would fight each other and destroy each other. And the last time they had that, that's when Mars turned into this orange ball, right? And so they were like, well, the few thousands of years that this planet still got in it, let's live a peaceful life. Let us abandon the story. And they sort of like forbidden themselves to think of themselves as the great old ones, for
Mm.
there is a certain irony in calling them the great old ones, because they are the ones who destroyed the world, right? So it's like the great old ones who taught us the lesson to never be like them. And that would be
That would have been a great story. Yeah, I can see, because you could have built up to Bert wanting to recreate the uh, the dynamism of humanity, and then he finds out that the dynamism was exactly what the great old ones were um, trying to do without, or put an end to. Yeah, that would have been great. I would have preferred that to No Place Like Earth. Yeah.
there you go.
Still, there we go.
Thank you very much. What did you want to say still?
Pardon?
What did you say, Robert? Oh, okay, okay. No,
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 it's all right.
nothing. And yeah, do you have an idea for a sequel, Robert? Or
No,
you're
I
gonna stick
didn't.
on my one?
I didn't. No,
No.
I'm not very
Okay.
good at that sort of thing.
Oh, you can try one day. Come on. Maybe not today, but
Yeah.
yeah. Actually, what are you? Either your thoughts on my idea, or if you have your own idea.
I think your idea is pretty good to just expand on the mystery of the one thing that the biggest enigma in the entire world building. Uh, and yeah, I think the great old ones are very interesting. Are definitely interesting. They raise a lot of questions, right? Where are
Mm,
they? Where had they? Where what happened to them? When did they come from? Where did they come from? And what were they like? And all that sort of stuff. Because clearly they existed even long before uh, humanity had gotten out of the civilizational cradle, so to speak, because they are
mm.
long gone.
Mm.
We got hints of that in the first story. We got more hints of that in the second story. But then that's it. So yeah,
I would call it like hints in the second story. Just literally like maybe a paragraph about the great old ones.
I mean
Mm.
it. So the architecture that he described, that John Wyndham described, actually gave some insights to to the great old ones, and architecture is a reflection of how of a culture, isn't it? And
Would you be so kind as to share this revelation with us, because I have no idea what you mean.
honestly, there's too little to go on, but they clearly don't like straight lines.
Okay.
It's
I
feng
mean-
shui. They got feng shui.
It, I mean, you read it right. They like pillars that is a little bit bulgy and that. So I mean, just saying that alone shows certain things. A culture that likes straight lines are pretty probably price uh, a methodical approach to certain things.
Yeah,
You know,
logic.
engineering is probably one of their highlights, very important to them.
Efficiency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you're not, if the stuff you're building is all curves and stuff like that, then it's a different thing. It doesn't mean that they are not engineering centered, because making curves really well is very difficult from an engineering perspective. But clearly they are not a race that prizes what we would think of as efficiency, you know.
Mm.
So it gives some hints as to their mindset, like the architecture. So I would say you're right. It's just a paragraph or two, but those are important paragraphs because it gives a mindset to the beings that built up Mars way back when. So yeah, I agree with you. It would have been fascinating to explore more of the great old ones. But I already said how this story would have been better, which is to actually write it as a story. Yeah.
Right.
All right.
Yeah, okay.
We are now over an hour. It's been, I guess, a contentious discussion. Are there any last thoughts?
I've got one last thought, which is
Mhm.
the drastic scene changes, like suddenly from Mars to Venus and so on, from Venus back to Mars, were a way of keeping the story shorter. I don't think Wyndham wanted to write a long novella here. That's just a technical point, and I think that, bearing that in mind, I think it was skillfully done that the scene changes.
Fair enough.
Okay. What is your score out of 10, Robert?
Oh, I'd give it maybe 6 out of 10.
Ooh, that's
Compared to about roughly 10 out of 10, if not more, for Time to Rest.
if not more. Is this the lowest score you have ever given?
No, I
think-
gave last week's one 3 out of 10, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, it shows how much you pay attention, actually. All right. So, from my perspective, the Jedi are evil. No, from my perspective, the tale suffers greatly because of its ending. Now, I have to give it my original thoughts, but I also have to sort of, now knowing how I actually saw it, right, and now seeing similarities in what he means, that also kind of affects the way I see it now. Let me put it this way: as a tale, it would probably get like a 6 or a 5 out of 10 for me, but because of the ending, I think it gets my, you know, rotten approved 1 out of 10. Absolute garbage.
Rotten Tomatoes, eh?
Yeah, exactly. Like an absolute 1 out of 10 for me, because it's a cop out ending, terrible implications. Bert becomes a mass murderer like right at the end, and it's showcased like it's a good thing, like it's a, moral of the story, children. destroy the last hopes of humanity and be with your alien waifu. Whatever. Yeah. 1 out of 10.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to cop out and not give it a score because we rate stories here, and this is not a story to me.
Ooh,
Yeah.
damn. All right.
All right. Well,
Score, it just says you ungraded.
ungraded. Yes. Kind of like my my A levels for my math. Ungraded because I did take it.
Only because you didn't have me to teach you. That's
So my elementary maths, my D maths was okay. My A maths was horrible. I didn't even take it, so it's ungraded.
Terrible. I cannot help but remember how joyful and excited both of you were when I announced in Time to Rest,
Yeah.
like, hey guys, No Place Like Earth. It's a sequel to
Yeah.
the story. You're like, oh my god, can't wait to read it.
Yeah. Very
Yeah.
well. Yeah, it was
I
a
still
bit of a
think it's a
disappointment.
powerful story. It's a powerful story.
If you consider it a story, I'd like actually.
It's a powerful piece of writing.
Okay. All right. Okay.
All right, man.
So, final thing I want to say before we close out. This is a big problem with a lot of sequels. A lot of the time, somebody writes a good story or has a good movie, and then when the sequel comes, it falls apart. And in my opinion, the reason this story really falls apart as a tale is because it takes nothing of the original to its core to propagate it. It takes the same mood, the depressive atmosphere, and it tries to take the same sort of like flux of individualism of Bert, but instead of going through the logical conclusion of rebelling and fighting against the odds that are terrible. It reserves to try and be both depressive and uplifting at the same time, like Time to Rest was, but missing the heart of it. I think that's the problem with it. The core of the story just basically doesn't function as a sequel to Time to Rest because it fails to see what made Time to Rest so great. And I implore everyone, whoever writes a sequel that's coming from a successful work, maybe read your story again or watch your movie again and see exactly why it works.
Well, authors often don't understand why their own stuff works. I come
That's
across
true.
this again
That
and
is
again.
very true.
That is true.
They're like diggers who access a huge fountain of whatever oil or something from within themselves, and they don't have any real control over it.
Yeah. Well,
That is a good point.
that is true. So, and with that, we have come to the end of the podcast. If you've enjoyed the discussion, please share your thoughts with us in the comments below and like and subscribe to follow us and all that jazz. And with that, we bid you a fond farewell until the next time.
Take care, guys. Thank you so much for coming.